3 children, 1 mother, 1 critical window of time, and a single question that lies at the heart of this legal proceeding. Was this a deliberate sequence of planned actions, or, as the defense contends, the result of a severe psychiatric crisis? On a cold evening in January 2023, 3 young children were found unresponsive inside a quiet Massachusetts home. Their mother was discovered severely injured in the backyard after falling from a second-story window. After she regained consciousness in the hospital, court records indicate that she communicated a question in writing about whether she had legal representation. To state prosecutors, that inquiry was presented as evidence suggesting she retained an awareness of her circumstances and potential legal exposure. The defense, however, presented that exact same moment, and this entire case, from a fundamentally different perspective. They argued that asking a basic question upon waking up disoriented in an intensive care unit does not establish her mental state hours earlier. They maintained that behind the apparently organized actions was an escalating, severe psychiatric crisis that had been building for months. And that is what makes this case so legally and psychologically complex. Several of the case's most important pieces of evidence can be interpreted in sharply different ways, depending on how her frame of mind is evaluated. Tonight, as trial proceedings unfold in court, we systematically examine the physical evidence, the timeline arguments, the journal entries, and the strict legal standards under state law to address the core line dividing this entire case. The fundamental difference between what a person did and what was happening inside her mind when she did it. To understand how both sides interpret her frame of mind, we examine the window of time prosecutors focused on during court proceedings. To state prosecutors, January 24, 2023, was not merely the day of an unimaginable family tragedy. They argued it involved a sequence of choices designed to create an uninterrupted window of time alone in the house. Earlier that afternoon, Lindsay took her 5-year-old daughter Cora to a routine medical appointment. According to accounts referenced in court proceedings, her interaction with clinic staff was described as routine, with no outward reports of acute emotional distress noted at the time. Later that afternoon, she texted her husband, Patrick, regarding takeout food for dinner, selecting 3V, a restaurant located in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Prosecutors focused heavily on the argument that this restaurant was farther from the family home than closer dining options, while also requesting that Patrick stop at a nearby pharmacy for pediatric medication. To prosecutors, this choice of location was part of their argument that the events involved advanced planning. They argued that selecting a restaurant further away, combined with the pharmacy errand, was intended to extend her husband's time away from the residence. At 5:15 p.m., her husband left the home to complete the errands. 18 minutes later, at 5:33 p.m., he called Lindsay directly from the pharmacy to confirm details regarding the medication. The call was brief, lasting approximately 14 seconds, with court testimony describing her tone as calm. Prosecutors presented that brief, calm phone call as evidence of cognitive composure and situational awareness during those critical minutes. The defense, however, raised a fundamentally different counterargument. Does an outward appearance of calm during a brief domestic exchange rule out an unfolding psychiatric crisis? The defense argued that outwardly routine behavior did not, by itself, establish the absence of a severe psychiatric crisis. At 6:09 p.m., her husband returned to the home. Prosecutors calculated an interval of approximately 54 minutes between his departure and return. The time frame prosecutors argue provided the opportunity for these acts to take place without anyone else present. What was discovered inside that house would become a central part of the prosecution's physical evidence case. Upon returning home at 6:09 p.m., her husband encountered silence in the residence. Searching the property, he discovered evidence of injury in an upstairs bedroom and found Lindsay severely injured in the backyard after a fall from a second-story window. A 911 call was placed at 6:10 p.m., dispatching emergency responders and local police to the scene. When officers searched the basement, they discovered the 3 children. 5-year-old Cora and 8-month-old Callan were located in a basement den area. while 3-year-old Dawson was found in an adjoining basement office space. Emergency responders immediately initiated life-saving measures. Cora and Dawson were rushed to a nearby hospital, where they were pronounced deceased that evening. 8-month-old Callan was airlifted to Boston Children's Hospital in critical condition, remaining on life support until passing away 3 days later. Court filings and physical evidence presented in hearings identified exercise bands as the instruments involved. Prosecutors argued that the physical evidence was consistent with sustained physical pressure and required time and continued physical effort. From that temporal gap between acts, prosecutors argued there were distinct opportunities to pause and stop. The defense, however, raised a stark counter-question. Does physical duration tell us what was happening inside her mind, or could it be consistent with the severe psychiatric impairment described by the defense? They maintained that the passage of time alone does not establish whether she had the legally required capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct. Beyond the competing timeline calculations, the medical testimony, and the strict legal theories, 3 children remain at the absolute center of this case. Cora was 5 years old. Dawson was 3. Callan was only 8 months old. Every journal entry, medical record, timeline, and legal argument ultimately leads back to what happened to those 3 young lives inside that house. While the prosecution built its case around logistics, distance calculations, and outward composure, the medical history presented by the defense offered a dramatically different context for the months leading up to January 24th. According to evidence presented by the defense, Lindsay Clancy had sought medical care for anxiety, depression, and postpartum-related symptoms in the months leading up to January 24th. Records presented in court indicated she had been evaluated by multiple healthcare professionals and prescribed various psychiatric medications over a relatively short period. Her private journal entries describe an internal struggle that stood in sharp contrast to her daily routines. In one private entry read into the record during court proceedings, she wrote that she felt like her mind never shut off, describing herself as desperate for a mental break to the point that her anxiety was causing physical distress. In another excerpt detailing her daily struggle, she noted her deep desire to recover and enjoy her life, while expressing that the anxiety and depression felt overwhelming. Here is where the written record becomes one of the most compelling points of confrontation in court. The prosecution pointed to these exact journals, noting that Lindsay logged schedules, child routines, and medication details, arguing that this level of organization reflected functional cognitive capacity and conscious control. The defense presented those same entries as evidence of severe insomnia, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, and worsening psychological distress, describing someone experiencing significant psychiatric distress while continuing to seek medical treatment. The restaurant choice didn't change. The 14-second phone call didn't change. The journal entries didn't change. The written hospital inquiry didn't change. The evidence didn't change. What changed was what each side argued that evidence meant. When viewing the record as a whole, several of the case's most important pieces of evidence can be interpreted in sharply different ways. Regarding the dinner order and pharmacy run, prosecutors argue it was a calculated move to ensure an uninterrupted window of time alone in the house, while the defense frames it as a routine family decision regarding dinner and medication for a sick child. Regarding the calm 14-second phone call, prosecutors argue it shows cognitive composure immediately preceding the events, whereas the defense argues that superficial outward composure can still coexist with severe postpartum psychiatric distress. Regarding the written inquiry asking about legal representation, prosecutors argue it shows rational thinking and awareness of legal exposure, while the defense argues that it reflected a disoriented reaction upon regaining consciousness in an intensive care unit. And regarding the fall from the second-story window, prosecutors argue it was a post-incident act that does not negate prior deliberate choices, while the defense points to it as evidence of a severe suicidal crisis that they argued was part of the same psychiatric deterioration. That brings us directly to the core legal standard governing this case. The legal dispute extends beyond whether Lindsay Clancy committed the physical acts alleged by the prosecution. It centers on whether she can be held criminally responsible for those acts under Massachusetts law. Under the governing Massachusetts legal standard, A person is not criminally responsible if, at the time of the conduct, as a result of mental disease or defect, they lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. Put simply, the question is whether a qualifying mental disease or defect substantially impaired either her ability to understand that wrongfulness or her ability to conform her conduct to the law. Evidence showing that an individual appeared organized or rational at certain moments may be relevant to evaluating mental state, but the central legal question remains her capacity at the precise time of the alleged offenses. The legal standard is narrow, precise, and deeply complex. What was happening inside her mind at the exact moment these acts occurred? The physical evidence may show us what happened. The legal question is whether it can also tell us what was happening inside her mind when it happened. As legal proceedings continue, we will follow the court record and the evidence as it is formally presented. Thank you for watching.